Go. Good morning, everyone. Good day and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar titled Occupational Health in Action. My name is Kerry Chung and I'm President-elect of IOHA and Secretary of the New Zealand Occupational Hygiene Society. I will introduce to you today's presenter shortly, but before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded. Your cameras and microphones are off for the duration of the webinar. We should have a fair amount of time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. If you would like to come off during the time of the webinar to ask your questions, we can unmute you then, and also throughout the webinar. Please use the Q&A function to help us better track questions for the Q&A session. A very brief word on IOHA. IOHA is an umbrella association with 43 member organisations. The 43 organisations make up more than 20,000 occupational hygiene and allied professionals globally. There are several committees with ongoing projects and work to continuously advance IOHA's vision of a safe and healthy working environment for all. If you are a member of an IOHA member organisation and would like to learn more or volunteer, please get in touch and let us know. If you are joining us today from a country that does not yet have a professional organisation and would like support from IOHA in getting started, please let us know. Our website address is www.ioha.net, and you can find more information and news there. You can also follow us on LinkedIn to stay up to date. I would also like to thank Amazon for sponsoring IOHA for the 3rd year in a row. Amazon funds are dedicated to education and training in occupational hygiene. We do several webinars a year and have some wonderful world-class speakers, so please continue to join us. And now for some introductions. I have the great honour and pleasure of introducing today's speaker. Dr. Mary Oberly is an occupational and environmental health physician with over 20 years experience working across a wide range of industries to improve worker health through prevention and better work design. She has held senior roles in national and international occupational health programs and has advised governments, industry, and professional bodies on practical approaches to workplace risk and health protection. Dr. Oberly is a fellow of the Australia and New Zealand Faculty of Occupational Medicine and is especially interested in how occupational health, occupational hygiene, and system design can work together to prevent disease rather than simply manage its consequences. So please, take it away, Mary.
Thanks, Kerry. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm just letting everyone know that I can't actually see the chat as I'm talking. So I'm hoping that, Kerry, you'll be able to help me with any questions that are coming through.
Yes, I will.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening. Thank you for joining. So my name's Dr. Mary Oberly. I'm an occupational physician, and it's a pleasure to be with you at this IOHA webinar, which is called The Future of Occupational Health, Why Occupational Hygiene Must Lead. Now, as a doctor in many workplaces, I work at the clinical end of the story, where there's disease and disability and burnout in front of me, and I see the downstream consequences of the decisions that were made quietly years beforehand, often with good intentions and often without full visibility of their long-term effects. And many of you, as occupational hygienists, work at the beginning of that story, where the exposure and the work design are determined. So I want to talk today about how those worlds need to come much closer together and why I think occupational hygienists in particular have to be far more visible and influential in the next decade. So from my side, as a physician, I see the later chapters, the chronic lung disease that could have been prevented, the worker that leaves the workplace 10 years too early, the nurse who's completely exhausted by a system that was never designed for humans. And from your side, as occupational hygienists, you see the early chapters, the tasks, the materials, the design decisions, the shortcuts, and the controls that nearly work. So my core argument today is simple. The future of occupational health depends on the visibility and influence of occupational hygiene. If your work as an occupational hygienist remains invisible, the system will continue to just treat disease instead of redesigning work. Occupational health will remain reactive, and reactive systems don't deliver prevention at scale. So what we're going to do today is first we're going to look at where we are now, how hygienists are actually working, and how occupational hygienists are often seen in organisations. Secondly, we'll look ahead to what an integrated occupational health and hygiene model might look like by 2030. Not fantasy, but credible evolution. And third, we will name the barriers honestly, the structural ones, the political ones, the ethical ones. And fourthly, we'll talk about influence and visibility, not as a YouTube influencer thing and not as an exercise in self-promotion, but as part of your professional ethics. And then we'll finish with some very concrete actions for 2026 and a personal influence plan for each of you, plus a way to continue the conversation through IOHA. So before we start, Kerry, before we think about the reality, let's get a picture of who's here. In the chat, could you please type in your job title, maybe your sector or your region if you want to, and really importantly, I'd like to ask you to add one word describing how your expertise is usually seen in your organisation or the organisations that you work for. So are you seen more as technical, support, strategic, compliance, or maybe even invisible? Now, Kerry, can you just read a few out? Yeah.
So I've put a Q&A conversation for people to type in there, or if they type it in the chat, I'll read those out as well. So we've got people from the USA who's a researcher or a practitioner and works in several sectors. I can say myself, I work in New Zealand as a subject matter expert in occupational hygiene, covering several sectors as well.
Okay, so
we've also got, from the United States, New Jersey, retired research and author, Ireland, inspector, works in all sectors, technical, consultant, technical in Abu Dhabi.
Thank you, Kerry. So what I usually see is that the work that hygienists do is, in my mind, quite sophisticated and anticipatory and strategic, but the label support or technical is quite narrow. And that's the gap between the reality and the perception. What occupational hygienists actually do and how you're framed, I think, is one of the most important problems that we need to address today. So let's be clear with what occupational hygienists already do. Anticipate risk, recognise, evaluate, control risks, chemical, physical, biological, ergonomic, psychosocial. You often see the hazards, before anyone else has even got the language for them. In practical terms, you may be the ones who decide, often quietly, which hazards are tolerated and which are engineered away or substituted, controlled or eliminated. And if you don't decide it, you're at least recommending it. So I think that a lot of the disease that never appears in my clinic will be because of the decisions that occupational hygienists have already made or recommended. But the problem is that almost nobody in your organisation will ever see that outcome, and therefore they underestimate you quite dramatically. So despite that reality, many organisations still see hygienists as measurement technicians, or the people that make the numbers go into the report so that we can file it. You're brought in late after the process is designed, after the contract is signed, after the warehouse is built. And you're often asked the narrow question, are we compliant? Rather than the important question, is this level of risk tolerable for these people in this context? And that gap between your expertise and your authority is the central problem that I want us to discuss. So we're just going to take a moment here, Kerry, for everyone to think of just one situation last year where you went along with something, or in the last few years, where you went along with something that you weren't fully comfortable with because you felt you had no choice. And what I'd like you to think about is, what would say a 10% braver version of you have done in that moment? And I'm just going to give you a few seconds to think about that, and then we're going to move on.
Mary, while people think about their responses, my own experience is speaking up when I felt something was not professionally right. I do realise it takes courage, but a huge privilege to be able to do that, depending on people's circumstances as well.
Thank you. So let's do a little case study. It's a food packing plant, and it's using a cleaning agent. The hygienist has done the right thing. Periodic air measurements, levels consistently below the national exposure standard, and the reports look respectable, and everyone relaxes. Over a couple of years, the occupational health nurse notices a drift. More workers from one area turning up with cough and throat irritation, early asthma-like symptoms, and they see their primary care physician or family doctor. They get inhalers, and it's all slightly vague. And because the hygiene data says within the normal limits, nobody links these complaints to the work in any systematic way. And the symptoms are written off as a virus or smoking or sensitive airways or even stress. So hygiene lives in one world and clinical data in another. And as I describe this, I want you to notice whether you're thinking, yep, I've seen this, or no, it would never happen where I work. So eventually someone gets curious, and a joint review puts together 3 things that had existed for years but had never been viewed side by side. So the exposure data, the job and location data, and the symptom records. And suddenly a pattern appears. The problem is clustered in a subgroup who work closest to a poorly placed exhaust at certain times of the shift. Technically, they were under the limit, but practically people were clearly unwell. And at this point, management says, we're compliant, we're not going to justify any major changes. And this is where your influence matters, because deciding that compliant but harmful is acceptable is not a technical decision, it's an organisational and ethical decision. So maybe type in the chat, does this sound familiar? You can say something like seen it in the chat if you've seen something like this before.
Got one story here. We were brought in on a railway tunnel project after the company hired a consulting firm without any expertise in industrial hygiene or occupational hygiene. Workers were exposed to sulfur dioxide and alarms were going off. Instruments without any notification to protect management. The construction company was unaware of the exposure to diesel truck emissions and the conversion of sulfur dioxide in the air to sulfuric acid due to the relative humidity.
Yeah, so these are the kind of things that we want to discuss today. How are we going to manage this? So let's just do one more case just to kind of get us thinking. So this is a small analytical laboratory that uses organic solvents. So ventilation meets specification, and the original commissioning report looks fine. Spot measurements that were done years ago were comfortably under the limits, but over time, 3 senior experienced technicians start to complain to their doctors about headaches and poor concentration and brain fog, and they're given sick notes for stress or mild anxiety, and no one makes the connection with work. There's no structured health surveillance program, and no one is looking at the sickness absence patterns. And the work practices have drifted. Lids of the solvents are left off occasionally, and there's more manual handling solvents than was originally planned. And none of this appears in the original report. So eventually, the new occupational physician looks at the absence data and notices the pattern. And a conversation with the occupational hygienist leads to updated measurements during real work, not staged conditions. And we find intermittent higher exposures at specific tasks, which are easily amenable to control with some better local practice and some engineering. And now the tension appears. So before I tell you what happened next, what do you think management focused on? Cost, compliance, or liability? Type one word. So Kerry?
We've got cost in all caps.
So,
a lot of people typing in costs. We've got one for liability and one for compliance.
Yep, absolutely. And everybody's right. So management is worried that acknowledging that work contribution will open them up to liability and cost. And they're very keen to be reassured by the old tidy data and not the awkward new picture. And the hygienist is under subtle pressure to emphasize the positive, and that's where professional identity matters. Are you the person that dampens the signal, or are you the person that says calmly, we've learned something new and we need to act? So what would a better system look like by, say, 2030? Imagine that joint hygiene and clinical risk reviews are routine. So exposure data and health data live in the same place, and we actually look at them together. Imagine that hygienists are involved before the factory layout is finished, before the new adhesives are selected, before the contract is signed with that low-cost supplier. Imagine that prevention is baked into how work is designed, not added later as PPE and training after the fact. Now, I don't think that this is science fiction. I see parts of this already exist in some organisations. The question is how to make this normal and not exceptional. So in an integrated model, you don't carry this alone. So the hygienist brings exposure science control strategies. The occupational nurse and physician bring knowledge of disease patterns and individual vulnerability and health surveillance and fitness for work. The ergonomists and the mental health professionals bring insight into the workload and the cognitive demands and the psychosocial risks. And the safety HR operations, they bring the implementation power, the resources and levers on behaviour and culture. And most importantly, the workers bring reality, what actually happens, not what the procedure says. So in that room, your role is not the dust person. Your role is to help answer the question, what are we doing to people over time in the system, and how can we actually change the design? So when those pieces click, outcomes genuinely change. Risks are detected earlier and controlled before they produce disease. The burden of occupational disease declines, not just the reports are tidier. Inequalities are reduced. Contractors are not treated as disposable. And workers in low-income countries are not simply sacrificed to keep supply chains cheap. Organisations become more resilient. They have fewer shocks, better retention, and more credible sustainability story. But none of that happens because of a poster campaign. It happens because when people like us are part of this decision making. So another case study, let's look at a different domain, psychosocial risk in healthcare. So it's a large hospital. Staff report exhaustion, aggression from patients and relatives, and a kind of moral distress having to deliver healthcare they know is substandard because the system is under pressure. And there's incidents of verbal abuse and near misses recorded, and the response from management, very familiar to me, resilience training, mindfulness sessions, and a wellbeing week. So I think mindfulness is a wonderful thing, but there's no serious work on the workload, the staffing levels, the patient flow, the ward layout, the alarm fatigue, the noise. The system persists, people burn out, errors continue, and we're all told to meditate more. So now imagine a hygienist working with the occupational physician and that hospital, deciding to treat this as you would any other exposure problem. So you map where aggression and incidents occur, at what times, with which triggers, and you look at the noise levels, the alarm frequency, the lighting, the shift patterns, the staffing ratios, and you discover hotspots, poorly designed waiting areas that inflame frustration, wards where the alarms are so frequent that the nurses are in constant low-level fight and flight. And you propose redesign, different patient flow, physical barriers in specific spots, improved visibility, adjusted staff for peak times, rationalised alarms. So you are not arguing about whether the nurses should be more resilient. You're saying the system designed this harm and we can redesign it. That is occupational hygiene thinking applied to psychosocial risk. And one more ingredient here comes from engineering. So engineers are trained to design in margins of safety and redundancy. So they ask, if this fails, what happens next? And they try and make sure that a single mistake doesn't equal catastrophe. So they use structured risk tools like the failure modes and effect analysis to ask systematically where things can go wrong. So hygiene can borrow that engineering mindset, and you can ask yourself, where in my organization are we relying on perfect human behavior inside a badly designed system? If your controls only work where everyone is alert, well-trained and motivated and perfectly supervised, you don't have controls, you've got hope. So if all of this sounds lovely and but very distant, that's for a reason. And that's because there are real barriers. So structurally, occupational health and hygiene are often placed very low in the organisation with little access to those boardrooms where strategy and investment decisions are made. And culturally, hygienists are often pigeonholed as technical staff, as you were saying, Kerry, not as strategic partners. And systematically, data are fragmented. Your contracts can be short term, and the incentives, and we all know this, reward production and cost cutting and profit far more visibly than they reward prevention. And personally, many of us recognize that fear of being seen as difficult or alarmist if you keep pressing that issue. So I acknowledge that we're not imagining these obstacles. The question is, what are we going to do about them? Kerry, what's coming up in the chat?
Yeah, so as an iteration of the current issue that there's an assumption that most of the industrial hygiene or occupational hygiene staff are present in the organizations in the scenarios. However, most businesses don't have such capability in staffing and rely on consultants or even loss control audits to provide the information of worker health. So much of the work that an occupational hygienist can do is limited in scope.
Thank you. And Moshe, I've seen that you've got a question, and if you could just hold it, because I think maybe I might be able to answer it for you, or at least in the questions and answers at the end. So I'm going to talk to you about another case study, and it's a logistics operation in a hot climate, large warehouse. And each summer, a handful of workers present with heat exhaustion symptoms. So dizziness, nausea, collapse, and a few end up in emergency departments. Thankfully, no one dies. Each incident is treated as isolated, and the organisational response is to tell people to drink more water and to be heat aware. And posters appear, and fans are moved around a bit, and the incidents continue. And the occupational hygienist has raised concerns for years, but without a compelling visual story, the issue remains background noise. So one hygienist decides to tackle this differently, and they gather three basic pieces of information that already exist: the times and locations of the heat incidents, the temperature readings from the warehouse, and the shift patterns in the job roles. And they put them into a simple graph or a map, and it's suddenly obvious. The incidents cluster in one bay on late shifts on the hottest days. So rather than demanding a multi-million pound redesign, they propose a pilot. So how about we do local cooling in that bay, a shaded rest area close by, scheduled micro breaks at peak heat, and add a red flag rule tied to the weather forecast temperatures. So it's targeted, time limited, affordable, and importantly, it comes with a plan to measure the impact. And that's how authority grows, through small, credible wins. So during that pilot season, heat incidents in that bay drop sharply. And the warehouse manager, quite understandably, this is a true case, presents this to senior management as his success, evidence-based, targeted controls that protected people and productivity. But the occupational hygienist here has done two things. They've reduced the risk for the workers, but they've also demonstrated that their work in occupational hygiene creates visible value. And then the next time they raise an issue, they're harder to ignore. And that's the pattern that I want you to notice. The small, focused, data-informed interventions that build your authority over time. So now I want to talk openly about influence. And I'm not talking about YouTube influence. And I know some of you will feel very uneasy about this word because it may sound manipulative. But what I'm arguing for is high integrity influence as part of your professional duty. And that means you're anchored in evidence and you don't massage the data to please anyone. You're transparent about uncertainty and trade-offs. You're explicit about the values, so worker dignity, equity, sustainability, not just cost. And you're realistic about power, so who decides, what they care about, and how to reach them. These are real. And I'm not pretending that you can overcome the barriers with enthusiasm alone, but that invisibility of occupational hygienists is not safer. It means that other people are designing what level of risk the workers will live with, like that example that Kerry read out. Being influential in that sense is not just making yourself look good, it's part of not colluding with systems that quietly accept avoidable harm. So a little detour into human psychology. Most leaders don't change their mind because of a beautiful dose response curve. They change because the data is attached to a story about real people. And there's a sense of loss if nothing is done. And there's social proof. This is what our peers are doing in the company down the road. And the change fits with their sense of themselves as decent and competent people. So, as occupational hygienists, when you present, think in those terms. Here is what is happening. Here is why it matters for people and for our business. Here is what others are doing, and here is the reasonable next step for us. So I'm just going to repeat that. So what's happening, why it matters for people and our business, what others are doing, and what's the reasonable next step for us. So your job could be to make the safer, fairer choice feel normal and responsible and not radical. What are people saying in the chat, Kerry?
So board members only care about the cost-benefit analysis associated with industrial hygiene concerns. So the advice is to construct a business case analysis that proves the case for change management.
Yep.
Well,
Okay,
we also
so,
had previous comments on previous slides, but I'll leave that in the chat.
Excellent, and we'll talk about it through the questions as well. So influence is not just about clever presentations and business cases, it's also about process. So thinking about some practical examples. So think about whether you could do any of these things. Set up regular joint case conferences where hygiene, clinical staff, and operations review recurring problems together. So it doesn't have to be fancy. An hour per quarter is a good start. What about shared dashboards or summaries where exposure data and health data sit together, even in very crude form, and patterns become harder to ignore? And what about explicit decision frameworks for tricky cases like I had one where pregnant workers with uncertain chemical exposures. If you make the logic visible, so what we know, what we don't know, what our principles are, and when your reasoning is visible, then people can argue with it, they can improve it, they can adopt it. What I'm saying is when all of this stays in your head or in your private notebook, then they can ignore it. So I'm just going to pause for 30 seconds just for people to have a bit of a think about what they could do, and then I'll continue. And just write things in the chat so that Kerry can use it as a question for me at the end. So Kerry, this brings us to you as a person and not just a set of technical skills as an occupational hygienist. So some of the most powerful moves that you can make are interpersonal communication, being clear and specific in what you ask for instead of broadcasting some vague concern. And listening carefully to what decision makers actually care about rather than assuming. So as you have already noted in the chat, continuity, cost, reputation, and law. Staying calm when challenged instead of collapsing or becoming combative. So there's also an emotional side, isn't there? Noticing your own frustration or cynicism or even that feeling of resignation. And those are all understandable, but if those feelings run the show, then you're going to give up on your influence before you even start. So one of the most radical things that you can do is refuse the sentence, this is how it is here. This is how we just do things here. Because it's really true. So let's make this extremely concrete. Here are 5 moves that I think you as occupational hygienists could plausibly make in 2026? Change the main questions that you answer. So when people say, are we compliant? Explicitly add, is this risk tolerable for these workers in this context, in this time frame? Co-create with clinicians. Run at least one joint case review each quarter with the occupational health nurse or medicine on some recurring problem like dermatitis or respiratory issues or fatigue or musculoskeletal complaints. Integrate exposure and health data in one live project, and protecting privacy and confidentiality. It may be as simple as cross-tabulating exposure groups with sickness absence or symptom reports. Insert hygiene into one upstream process. So, as an example, no new chemical can be approved without your sign-off. Just start in one of the small areas, don't try and do the whole organisation. And build one visible risk story for senior leadership. One slide, one issue, what's happening, why it matters, what you propose. Make it impossible for them to say, oh, I had no idea. So just sitting here and thinking about what part of this future feels the most achievable for where you work or how you work. Is it the joint reviews? Is it the data integration? Is it earlier involvement in design? Maybe even some psychosocial or cognitive exposure work. So I know some of you are thinking, probably many of you are thinking, Mary, this is lovely, but you don't know my organisation. So let's stay firmly in the realm of the doable. So I think, and I'm challenging you in the next 3 months, that most of you could do one of these things. So you could run one joint case review with your occupational health nurse or physician. Produce one page linking exposure, health outcomes, and the cost for a single issue. This is a good one. Turn one of your invisible achievements into a visible milestone. For example, since we changed whatever it was, we've had this many fewer incidents. Present once to a non-safety audience. Present to operations. Present to HR. Present to finance. Document one small win and share it internally. None of this requires a new budget line or a restructure, but it does require a decision that you're not going to stay invisible. So I'd like you to take 2 or 3 minutes now to sketch a simple plan for yourself. So I want you to write down 3 things. And you don't need to share it with anyone, but you can if you want to share it in the chat. Okay, so one influence outcome you want in 2026. For example, something like, I want to be involved in new process approvals for this department or this site. or secure engineering controls for the highest risk task in our plant. One skill that you will deliberately grow presenting to senior leaders, stakeholder mapping, how to tell a clear risk story. And the last one is one person that you're going to engage differently with next month. It could be a plant manager or an HR director, a union rep, somebody clinical. And we're going to, Kerry, take 3 minutes to do that.
While people take the time to write it down, I'll just summarize some of the chat that's been going on. So there was some talk about exposure data or measurement data not being robust enough or not even collected enough to give any logical conclusion for change or make any real decision. So without any other additional support from other sources, we may never know the real answer. Also, working with a limited data set renders occupational hygienists working in an uncertain or unknown environment as well. So do you have any comments around data collection towards reaching a conclusion or building a business case if we're so limited in that area?
Okay, so I think that requires let me think about that one and come back to that in the questions. Can you ask me that question again at the end?
Yeah.
Because I just want to finish the actual presentation and then think about that, because I think that there's a lot to be said there about not going back to just doing training in PPE, but also not, when you're doing the dust monitoring or whatever, not only doing 3 pumps, but being able to do more, and the cost questions and things like that. So I want to talk about that. So let's go back to that. I think we've had enough time for that personal influence and visibility plan. So we're nearly at the end of the actual presentation, so we're going to have lots of time to discuss things. I just didn't want this to be 90 minutes of inspiration, Kerry, followed by a slow slide back into business as usual. So one idea that I want to put to all of you, and to you, Kerry, as president of IOHA, is an integrated occupational health and hygiene practice lab. So imagine an IOHA hosted chat group or online space where we could bring real cases and small wins and dilemmas from around the world. Once a quarter, we could have a 60-minute online session with 2 or 3 people presenting a case, a success or a failure, and the group works on the influence strategy, not on the sampling plan. And rather than each of you wrestling alone, we could build maybe a global peer group that experiments and learns and shares what actually works in different contexts and also different income settings. And I think if that's something that you would use or that you'd like, then say so to IOHA after the session, because it only exists if you actually want it. So this is now the time for questions and answers, and I'm just going to get my brain, Kerry, into answering some of the questions that you've already posed. So things like how do we avoid taking on the accountability for the decisions that we don't control was one thing that came up. And I guess that's documenting your reasoning and being very clear in your writing what you recommended and why. And visibility protects you ethically and professionally. And then what do you do I think, was another question when the exposure science is unclear. Be explicit about the uncertainty. Decisions are still required, and precaution and transparency, I think, are very legitimate. And going on from that, how much evidence is enough when you're pushing for change? And I think enough is to show a plausible risk and a reasonable control, because waiting for perfect evidence often means waiting for disease. So that reconciling that evidence-based practice with precaution, say like in pregnancy, I see evidence and precaution as partners and not enemies. So in high uncertainty, the question becomes, given what we know about similar agents and the potential severity of harm, what level of precaution is justified? So make that framework visible. You know this, the hazard and exposure assessment, but also put in the uncertainty, the values and the principles, the options and their consequences, so that the decision isn't Mary's feelings versus the data. It's transparently balancing the limited evidence with the values and making the reasoning very visible. State what's known, what's unknown, and what values are guiding the decision. Kerry,
Yeah, so
other
Mary,
questions?
I've asked the group if they had any questions to type into the chat or raise the hand. So I've got a couple of hands raised. So I'll start unmuting them to
Shoot.
ask you any
Yep.
questions. Are you ready?
Okay.
Okay.
Yep, I'm
Cool.
ready.
So
Yeah.
Emanuela, I'm going to allow Mike.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carrie and Dr. Bella. It's great to hear you, and thank you so much for this very inspiring session. It's incredible. And also thank you very much, considering how early it is in New Zealand for you to wake up for this. So my question is this: what is your opinion about the fact that there's not safe space and events and opportunities for professionals in different disciplines to test the ideas that you presented? What I mean is professionals should try to improve the collaboration between hygienists and physicians and safety professionals and engineers while doing the job, which in my opinion is very stressful. And I wonder if you have an opinion about the lack of opportunities, events, conferences, roundtables, webinars, workshops, whatever you want to call it, where people can, in a safe environment, stress test this type of. There's no way, even for students. Everybody talks inside silos. So I wonder if you see that as an opportunity to try to implement this change.
Yeah, I see this as a real gap, and that's why I'm proposing the IOHA Joint Health and Occupational Hygiene Practice Lab. I want us to start measuring the impact of our influence. I think it's a really underdeveloped area. I totally agree with you. I think we should be tracking not just exposures, but how many decisions we influenced. So the number of the designs that were changed, the processes that were modified, procurement decisions that had your input. So track them all. Track the outcomes, trends and incidents, health surveillance, absenteeism, turnover rates in high-risk jobs, and track your reach. How often do you present to senior forums, cross-functional teams? How often do you present to non-safety audiences? So if we log it, we did Y and we did X and then Y changed, it starts to build that narrative that your role is strategic, not merely technical, and then present it to forums like the Practice Lab, or maybe IOHA can set things up like this. And I know that
IOHA conference is in 2027 in Montreal, so a session on this would be great.
Yeah, noted. So, and Kerry, I know that when I talk about visibility, it sort of sounds like personal branding and people feel uncomfortable about that. And again, I want to reiterate, I'm not asking you to be an influencer on social media. I'm asking that your work be traceable to outcomes so that it shapes future decisions. So visibility, in my mind, is making sure that there's a link between your work and those reduced risk and incidents, and that that's documented, and that turning your quietly good work into stories and numbers that travel inside your organization. Frame it. Workers are safer because of this intervention, and we should understand it and repeat it. So that's not self-promotion, that's professional duty. So it's not about you, it's about making the risk prevention that you do visible.
That is a very practical recommendation you have there, Mary. Really important. I totally agree. I've got another question from Renee LeBlanc, if you would like to answer that, Mary.
Renee.
Cool, you're unmuted, so please unmute yourself, Renee.
1, 2, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Thanks, Kerry. So great presentation. I really appreciate. And I wish you could give this presentation to ICO. I'm the past president of IOHA in 2020, and I'm actually one of the co-hosts of next year's, co-president of next year, a IOHA conference in Montreal. So I welcome you all to come to Montreal. But really, one of the main important thing I did after leaving IOHA as on the board, I joined ICO to increase collaboration between physicians and occupational hygienists, because honestly, I feel that there's a significant need to increase this collaboration. And actually, I'm working on my PhD right now on documenting the importance of interprofessional collaboration between physician and hygienist, because this is so little documented. There's lots of publication between physicians and nurse, between physicians and pharmacists, but there's almost no article on the importance and the value of interprofessional collaboration. So I would welcome you. Maybe I can talk to some people at ICO, but it would be great to do the same message. I think everybody, as the hygienist, we were listening to your speak with a lot of appreciation, but we definitely need to spread this message also to outside of the box. Thank you very much,
Absolutely. Mary. Absolutely, Renee, I totally agree. And I think that it sort of starts that question about how we can start integrating hygiene and health data when those systems are so siloed. And I think that you don't start with IT, you start with a pilot. So you pick one recurring issue, so respiratory symptoms, dermatitis, heat, fatigue, something real, and then you manually line up 3 things that already exist. So the exposure group, the job and location, and the health things or the absent patterns, and then just do it in a simple spreadsheet. Respect privacy and confidentiality, so de-identify it. You don't need a new system. You don't need a governance battle. And when you show a problem visually, and then the conversation shifts from we can't share data to we need to understand this. So governance problems are easier to solve once people can see why the data matters. And I think going on from that, one of the questions I think coming through in the chat is what happens if we're told as occupational hygienists, like legal tell us or HR tells us, you're not allowed to gather health information in case it creates liability. Well, I'd say that ignorance is not a defense. And if there's a reasonable possibility that work is harming people, refusing to look doesn't remove the liability, it increases it. So what I would do is try and design surveillance and data collection that respects privacy and legal constraints. So work closely with your HR and your legal team and your health team to explain how early detection actually reduces the legal and the financial risk. So where the law genuinely limits what you can collect because of privacy and confidentiality and employment laws, then you need to rely on more anonymous data and aggregate patterns. So don't look, so that we can deny is not a robust legal position. And liability comes from harm, not from knowledge. So that aggregated anonymized data pattern is usually sufficient and defensible as well. Kerry.
Yes, you have sort of answered this question, but I wonder if you had something else to add. So the question is, do you have examples of how to document and report the values associated with occupational hygiene or industrial hygiene work?
Maybe that's something that IOHA could actually work on, because I think I don't personally have that, because I am not in the business of justifying occupational hygiene, but I think that it's all these comments about, oh, this is, and what Renee was saying, it all sounds very idealistic, and in the real world, we don't have this power. And I would agree that occupational hygienists don't control everything, but no one in this field does. So what I'm talking about isn't perfection. It's those small targeted moves, and I'm going to keep repeating myself, inside those real constraints. So one joint case review, one upstream process that you insist that you're part of, one risk story that you tell differently. And if we all wait until we have perfect power, then nothing changes. So I'm interested in what's possible with the power that you as occupational hygienists already have. So you may have noticed that none of the examples in my talk required any organizational transformation. They required one person choosing to do one small piece of work differently and making the result visible. So a joint case review, or a single graph linking exposure and symptoms, or a single pilot in one location. And then that influence accumulates. It's built from credibility and not initially from authority. So a lot of occupational hygienists, I think, underestimate how much room to move they actually have, because they're imagining this really huge structural change rather than those small strategic moves.
Really practical advice there, Mary. Very valuable. I have a question from Matthew, our current president of IOHA. I have unmuted you, so if you would like to unmute your own mic.
Hey, Matthew.
Hi, Mary. Thank you so much. You can hear me, right?
Hey. Yes, I can.
Okay, excellent work. Thank you for this very great presentation.
Good start to the year, isn't it, Matthew?
Yeah, a great start, a great start. Mine is not it's not a question, but just to maybe buttress some of the things you've said and what the other speakers have said. So yes, we need to find real partners. And I think one of the most important partners for occupational hygienists will be the physicians. So talking about partnership again, I know a lot of occupational hygienists were technically focused, and that's almost like you need that to get your career going, right? But it gets to a time you need to realize that your technical skills is just a means of getting to an end, and the end is helping to prevent exposure to workers and making sure that people go back home healthy, right? So we need to get to a point where we realize that. And maybe it's this skills you've talked about. You've talked about a lot of skills during your presentation: communication, negotiation skills, getting buy-ins, influencing. Maybe this doesn't come naturally to some of us. And maybe we also need to look at how we actually raise occupational hygiene. I've been involved in a lot of capacity building discussion recently, and we've talked about how do we get an industrial hygienist, the education piece. Do we teach negotiation skills? Do we tell people how to influence, and some of the things you've talked about? It's really focused on the technical skills. So there is a gap in the way occupational hygienists come through the line, and I think there's an opportunity there to address some of these skills as you build occupational hygienists for the future. But the last comment I like to make is I like the recommendation for IOHA to have like a database where we share ideas. I used to work for a company where this was there was a tool. So I still remember how the tool looks like. You kind of say, this is the worker group or the that you're looking at. This is the number of people in this worker group. This is the exposure control project that has been implemented, and this is the resultant effect, and this is the impact on X number of people. It's like a SharePoint kind of database that people put in their work and the value that it brings, and we kind of share it and have presentations like that. So with this recommendation, it's something I would like to explore with the IOHA leadership team to see if we can share more globally and encourage people, to learn from simple wins across various regions, and they will have ideas on how to go implement similar things in their own space. But great work. Thank you so much.
That's why I'd love to promote the IOHA Practice Lab, and I only just talked to Kerry and the team about this morning, so that I kind of sprung it on you. Sorry, Kerry, but I do think it's really a cool thing to do, to share experiences. And I think it's that question about how you influence senior leadership. If occupational hygienists sit low in the organisation, and I think it's not by asking for a seat at the top table. I think you earn it with a visible win. So I'm going to repeat myself again, find one issue that matters to operations and solve it in a way that reduces the risk and improves the continuity and the cost and the productivity or the reputation, and make it visible. One slide, before and after. Leaders, I think, respond to people who reliably solve problems that they don't know how to solve. So run a small pilot, demonstrate success. Evidence weakens resistance. And another thing that people might be asking about is, how do I get that occupational nurse or occupational physician interested in me as an occupational hygienist? And what I do there is I'd start really small and be very specific. So don't go up to them and say, oh, let's integrate our work. Go up to them and say, could we look together at one pattern I'm seeing in dermatitis or asthma or fatigue, and bring them something that makes their life easier, make a clearer exposure context or a better basis for surveillance, a way to make a stronger case to management. And if after you have tried to do all of that and there's still no interest, well, then connect with a different clinician who's willing, and build from that pocket of collaboration, because you don't need everyone to start, you just need one or two allies.
Mary, I've got another question in the chat. What do you see the role of the regulator to influence these changes, or how could regulators influence engagement of key leaders with the occupational hygienists and the physicians?
I think it varies depending on the country. There's so many variations around the world that, it would be lovely if regulators would support this. and we live in hope. I think when people sit there and think, oh, this will never work where I am, whether it's the regulator or their organisation, I think that's quite an understandable reaction. And I think 70% of that is true, that it will never work where you are, because organisations, regulators, whatever, they do have constraints and politics and personalities and history, and you know that really well, Kerry. But about 30% of the answer to that question, never work where I am, is also protective, and it's that part that's preventing you testing what could be possible. So the question is, for the occupational hygienist, not can I do all of this? It's what 10% could I try in the next 3 months without asking anyone's permission? So start there. And it may not work exactly as I've described where you are, because contexts differ. But maybe you could ask, what's the smallest version of this that might work here? One ally instead of 3, one process instead of 10, a pilot in one area instead of a grand rollout. So, and then if the answer is genuinely in your organisation, if nothing at all is possible, then we're talking about whether you want to stay in that environment, which is again a separate thing. And so it's kind of comes out with all sorts of, it's like a 4-dimensional matrix, isn't it, Kerry, with the regulators and the organisations and the occupational hygienists and all those stakeholders.
Indeed, indeed. I've got another question from Emanuela. Do you think the location of hygiene in a company has an effect? Because he thinks if hygiene is under HR, for example, it's more challenging compared with hygiene being under health.
I haven't thought about that question, about where occupational hygienists sit best in the organisational map. What do you think, Kerry? What does anybody think? Can anyone answer that question? I haven't actually thought about that. Maybe Renee with his PhD.
Renee had to leave, but
Okay.
yes, Emanuela?
I can tell you, Mary, that in the US, hygiene in many companies is under HR.
Yeah.
Let's say in New Zealand or in Mexico, hygiene is under health, and covering some topics, let's say heat stress, which is heavily at the intersection of hygiene and health. In Mexico, is pretty straightforward. They don't have any problem to talk about health issues. Instead, in the US, hygiene being under HR, the idea of physiological monitoring or talking about health effects on workers for heat stress is very complicated still.
Yeah.
So anecdotally, I think has an effect, but I was wondering if you noticed something in your experience.
That's a really, really good question, because I'm just sitting here thinking I've seen hygiene under HR, under health, under safety, sort of slotted away in the corner somewhere. So that's a really good question. And I think that's something to incorporate into Matthew's question about how we can promote occupational hygienists as strategic partners. So to be continued. Kerry, any other questions coming through?
Yeah, not so far. Everyone,
okay.
Feel free to please come through. But I do have a question for you though, Mary. If you had to boil it down, your presentation so far, what one thing should occupational hygienists do differently from tomorrow onwards?
If I had to choose one thing, it would be this: stop asking only the question, are we compliant? So start answering, is this level of risk acceptable for these people doing this work over this time? And that single shift, Kerry, I think changes how you write your reports, how you speak in meetings, how you think about data, and how others see your role. And it moves you from a technician to a professional advisor on what risks workers have to live with. And that's the centre of the whole argument.
Thank you, Mary. We have no further questions in the chat, so I think now's a good time for you to maybe wrap up if you would like.
Okay, so I'm just going to say one thing. I think one thing that people might be asking is, does this feel as though I'm attacking the company? And the answer to that is no. I tend to frame it as compliance, and you and I have talked about this, Kerry. I say compliance is the floor, not the ceiling. So exposure limits are definitely a compromise between science and feasibility and politics. So I say things like, we're compliant, which is good, but the question is whether this level of risk is acceptable to us given what we know about the early health effects. So if we aim only for the legal minimum, we may still end up with preventable disease and reputational damage. That way you're not attacking the law or the company, you're pointing out the limitations and inviting the organisation to choose that higher standard and frame it as improvement and learning, not as failure. So I'm going to close with this. You're not just people who measure things. As occupational hygienists, you are people whose work helps to decide which risks the workers live with and which are designed out. For workers, this is about safety and health and dignity. And for organisations, it's about resilience and sustainability and reputation. And for you, it's about what I've been talking about, visibility, authority, and a career that truly matches the importance of what you do. So Matthew, Renee, everybody, by 2030, someone will have shaped how work and health interact. That will not wait for us. The only real question is whether occupational hygienists are at the centre of those decisions or if you're still trying to tidy up after them. And thank you for your attention and most importantly for your work.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's been a really informative, educational and powerful webinar that you delivered today. A lot of really good little practical steps that everyone can take away, myself included, to incorporate into your daily work.
I'll write a takeaway for the attendees that you can send to them.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who dialed in today and took your time to also participate in the chat and ask questions and be part of this discussion. We really value it as well. So thank you, everybody. And I hope you guys check out the IOHA website, ioha.net. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us through that website or through LinkedIn as well. Thank you so much, Mary, for your time today too.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you. Stay safe.
Goodbye, everyone.